Welcome to Perspective and Potential, where we uncover new ways to see the world and tap into the incredible potential within each of us. I'm Abigail Straight, joined by my co-host and mother, Gwen Fund. Together, we'll explore ideas, stories, and strategies designed to help you grow, shift your perspective, and embrace a more complete version of yourself. Whether you're ready for a big transformation or simply curious about the small steps you can take today, our goal is to inspire, encourage, and support you on your journey. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can check us out at perspectiveandpotential.com. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in and see where a new perspective might take you. Today, we're exploring a really foundational topic, quite literally, as we look at what the founding fathers really believed when they formed this nation. Were they religious men? Was God part of the plan? And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to say one nation under God. I mean, that phrase is everywhere. It's in the pledge, on our money, in political speeches, but the meaning behind it can get watered down. So I think the deeper question is, how does a society hold on to moral conviction without enforcing religion? Is that even possible? Sometimes we treat those founding fathers like they were flawless, or on the other end, like they were hypocrites. But maybe they were just people, complex, conflicted, trying to do something no one had ever done before. So let's start by setting the stage. When we talk about America being founded as one nation under God, what do you think most people picture? And is that vision accurate?
Well, it is definitely true that this nation was founded on Judeo Christian principles. And that really does make a lot of sense if we remember that many people braved this new wilderness in search of religious freedom. So by the time of the American Revolution, it is no surprise that each of the founding fathers were men of great religious conviction. Now, George Washington is quoted as saying, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." And when he was hailed after the amazing victory over the British Empire, he said, "Glorious indeed has been our contest, glorious if we consider the prize for which we have contended, and glorious in its issue. But in the midst of our joys, I hope that we shall not forget that to divine providence is to be ascribed the glory and the praise." Now, it was said of him that he had always been a deeply religious man, and his life motto was "For God and Country." And from headquarters on July 2nd, 1776, there was a general order that went out from him which stated, "The general hopes and trusts that every officer and man will endeavor to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country." And while he was there at Valley Forge, church services were held by the local clergy in the area, and attendance was not optional for all of his Christian soldiers. He always prayed on their behalf, and he himself seemed to be protected by some kind of divine providence. So, in his lifetime, he had survived diphtheria, malaria, tuberculosis, and smallpox. And in battle, he always led from the front, and miraculously, he would always come out unscathed. And at the end, many wanted him to be king of this new country. But after serving 2 terms as president, he voluntarily stepped down, setting the precedent for the peaceful transfer of power that we still see today. He really was the perfect example that true leadership is not about clinging to power, but of faithful service to their fellow man. Now, he has been criticized for being a slave owner during the time when slavery was legally approved, but many understood it to be morally wrong. However, it is important to note that in his will, he freed his slaves and gave them an inheritance. And further light into his character is revealed in the epitaph that one of his former slaves gave of him. His name was Mr. Richard Allen, and he is quoted as saying, "Our father and friend is taken from us. We, my friends, have particular cause to bemoan our loss. To us, he has been the sympathizing friend and tender father. He has watched over us and viewed our degraded and afflicted state with compassion and pity. His heart was not insensible to our suffering. He provided lands and comfortable accommodations for them when he kept this acceptable fast to the Lord. And those who had been slaves might rejoice in the day of their deliverance." Now, Washington is quoted as saying, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of more than one man than the people of the United States." And his parting advice to this country that he loved was, "The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home and your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, and of that very liberty which you so highly prize. Love your country, obey its laws, seek its peace, and to keep yourselves from attachment to any foreign nation."
That is just to hear those words. I don't know how you can't be inspired. And when I hear those quotes from Washington, especially about religion and morality being indispensable supports, I think what just hits me is how grounded he was, obviously, in strategy, but also in soul and spirit. And so it makes me wonder, are we still building public conversations on that kind of moral grounding? I mean, we talk a lot about progress, but do we know what we're progressing toward? And how do we know that it's good? I think that the founders had this compass that wasn't just political, it absolutely was spiritual.
Oh, I agree. And if we take a look at Benjamin Franklin, for instance, now he was different. Washington did come from, a pretty well off family, but Franklin came from a blue collar Puritan background, but he considered himself a deist. So, in other words, he did believe in a supreme creator, but he didn't really subscribe to any particular religious sect. However, he retained his belief in moral virtue and a deep respect for the scriptures. He was also an active Freemason. Now, that's not a recognized as a religion, but it does embrace religious values such as brotherhood, charity, personal improvement, and moral principles and conduct. And during the Constitutional Convention, it was Benjamin Franklin who called for opening prayer at every session so that the participants might remember their humility, gratitude, and equality before God. He was the only founding father to sign all four of the important documents of the time: the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Treaty of Alliance with France in 1777, the peace treaty with England in 1782, and the U.S. Constitution in 1787. And he was an active influence in the structure of the newly formed government through his participation in being helpful in writing the Constitution. Now, Benjamin Franklin was an avid learner and really a very hardworking person. And coming from his blue collar beginnings, he was able to rise to success as a newspaper publisher and writer. Now, he too was a slave owner in his early days, but by the end of his life, he not only freed his slaves in his will, but he had appealed to Congress in 1790 to abolish slavery in the United States.
Franklin's story just absolutely fascinates me. His life, I think, is a testament to the power of self improvement. He started with so little, being the son of a candlemaker, and then climbed his way into influence, not because of money or privilege, but because he valued learning, discipline, and civic contribution. And I think that that is something that we can all take to heart today. We live in a time when a lot of people might feel stuck or powerless, but I think what we can take from Franklin and his character is that with curiosity and a strong work ethic, those things still matter. And like you said, he didn't belong to a church, and yet he's the one who called for prayer. I I just think that that speaks volumes, that you do not have to be religious in a traditional sense to recognize, and we've talked about this before, but the importance of humility and reverence, especially to a greater power than yourself, when you're trying to do something, especially like they were, something as consequential as founding a nation, let alone, these things that we experience in our day to day lives. And I think ultimately we could use more of that posture today. Less certainty and more seeking. And so, even though he didn't claim a specific religion, I think he still ultimately had the humility to say, hey, you know what? We might need God's help here during the Constitutional Convention. And that level of self awareness is just something I wish we saw more of today. And we are not inherently humble as a society. But if we instead were more willing to be guided, and if our leaders, not and even just regular citizens, right, pause to pray or reflect before making big decisions, I just can't help but feel like that we would all in our personal lives and as a country be better off. What if we could reintroduce reverence, not as a formality, but as a guiding force in our choices?
I would love it.
Well, let's shift a little bit and talk about the Adams cousins.
Okay, so yeah, Samuel Adams and John Adams were cousins. And neither of them were slave owners. They were from Massachusetts. Now, Samuel was well educated and seemed to excel at political discussions and strategy. He was also a deacon in the Congregational Church. He was nicknamed by other patriots as the last Puritan. And his gift of gab allowed him to unify three rival groups into what we call the Sons of Liberty. He is said to be a principal player in planning and executing the Boston Tea Party. Samuel was selected to attend the First Continental Congress and was accompanied there by his cousin John. The two of them became well respected for their oratory skills and their desires for independence. Now, Samuel was elected to attend the Second Continental Congress, and at that one, he became a driving force for the state's independence from Britain because he had a zeal that amplified the cause of freedom. And Samuel was good at working with the common man who also wanted independence. Now, John, he was raised in a very strict religious home where religion and politics went together. His Puritan heritage was filled with heroes who braved the wilds of the New World in search of freedom. So he saw purpose and honor in their sacrifices and vowed to honor their legacy with his own actions in life. He became a lawyer, and after the Boston Massacre, it was interesting. He was charged with defending the British soldiers who were involved and to ensure that they got a fair trial. Of course, that wasn't a real popular opinion of the day, but he did. He went on and he won the case and he kept all but two of those men from punishment. The fervor of the day was not with the British, but John Adams served these men as befitting his own conscience and religious dedication. So he, again, also attended the First and Second Continental Congresses. He was, at first, reluctant to embrace the idea of separation from the mother country. But by June of 1775, it was John who nominated George Washington as commander in chief of the Continental Army. And by the fall of that year, it was John Adams who was pushing the separation from Great Britain through Congress. He had a keen intellect, and his ideas on government were sought by many. And it seemed that every colony wanted his advice on forming their own state governments. So in April of 1776, his thoughts were printed in the form of a book entitled Thoughts on Government, a letter from a gentleman to his friend. Now, the ideas listed in this document would go on to influence almost every one of those 13 state governments, as well as the Constitution of the United States. So, in this document, John Adams really had built the framework for the Constitution more than a decade before it was ever drafted.
Wow.
He suggested the separation of powers between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government, and that government must be confined to only certain enumerated powers. He is quoted as saying, "There's no good government but what is republican, that the only valuable part of the British Constitution is so because the very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men." So this man gave us the framework for a republic that has stood the test of time for almost 250 years now. And like you said, with the Pledge of Allegiance, we pledge to the republic for which it stands. I often hear people saying that we live in a democracy, but in truth, we live in a democratic republic. We democratically vote, but we are ruled by laws of the republic and the Constitution.
Hmm. I love how both Adam's cousins believed in the idea of government as a structure that should reflect moral order. But they also knew how dangerous unchecked passion and power could be. John Adams, in particular, seemed to wrestle deeply with the balance between freedom and restraint. And the reason I think that hits me is because I feel like we do live in a time where freedom is treated like this unqualified good, almost just like a blank check. But real freedom, the kind that lasts, is always rooted in some kind of responsibility.
Yes. And I think that's what we see as we study each of these men. They 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 believed it to be a right, but they also believed it to be a responsibility. And they
100.
were willing to put themselves on the line for it.
Mm-hmm.
So now, if we look at James Madison, he's a little different. Now, he was born on a very large 5,000-acre Virginia tobacco plantation. He was the oldest of 12 children, and he came from an Anglican Unitarian religious background. And he had even contemplated entering the clergy as a profession. But initially he found his niche in public service and politics. He was elected to local positions and eventually found himself attending the Virginia Convention, where he helped to draft the Constitution. He helped to strengthen the Republican form of government away from the Democratic Assembly of the Articles of Confederation, because he too believed in a moral order, and he opposed the centralization of power to a strong government. Now, he's quoted as saying, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. And if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." So Madison is associated with writings in the Federalist Papers, and he became a leader in the House of Representatives, an advisor to President Washington, Secretary of State to President Jefferson, and he was the fourth president of the United States. And while he never freed the slaves under his ownership, he argued against the slave trade during the Constitutional Convention. It was a topic of great struggle for him personally. He felt the economic need from the Southern plantations because that's where he grew up. But he also felt that it was a, quote, dishonorable blot to the national character. Now, he's credited with being the champion of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, which guarantee freedom of speech, the press, and religion, to name a few.
Something that strikes me as you were talking about how he argued against the slave trade. And I think that is one of the biggest arguments or criticisms of the founding fathers, is, the fact that they did not abolish slavery. And I think, like a lot of things that we work towards as a country, it did happen. It took time, but a lot of it was really built on the work that they had done, and if we go back to um, the quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." What he does is he acknowledges human nature without cynicism. And I think, you know what, we would invite him to listen to Perspective and Potential if he was, around today. But what he's saying, that people aren't hopeless. He's saying we're complex, right? We're capable of great good and great harm. And that's just such a realistic foundation to build a government on. It reminds me that a good system doesn't assume perfection. I honestly feel like that might be something that we struggle with today, that we just assume that all people should think as we think or do as they do. But that is not realistic. And they assumed the need for accountability, for limits, for checks, and even for repentance. And I think that that may be something that can be easily lost sight of.
Absolutely. You know, Thomas Jefferson, of course, is another one of the foundational fathers of our country. Um, he's a man of many talents, but he's also a man of a lot of um, questions, if you will. Um, so, as far as his talents go, he spoke 5 languages, and he was a member of the House of Burgesses. He became a master architect. He served in the Continental Congress. He was the governor of Virginia and the U.S. minister to France. He became the Secretary of State for President Washington. He himself was the third president of the United States. His knowledge and interests were so varied because he was also considered to be a philosopher, a scientist, an author, an inventor, a planter, a husband, and a father. He believed that the government is the servant of the people and not the master. Now, as far as his background, he too was born to an affluent family and he was provided with an excellent education. And along with his secular education, he was also tutored by both Anglican and Presbyterian clergy. Eventually, he landed in the profession of law to make his living. And as a lawyer, he represented a lot of slaves who were seeking their freedom, even though he himself was a slave owner. Now, in Virginia at that time, a slave could be given what they call manumission at the age of 33. And through these experiences that Jefferson had, he became entrenched with the idea that all men come into the world with a right to their own person and will, a God given natural right to certain inalienable pursuits such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, he is well known as the writer of the Declaration of Independence, but he also authored the Virginia Bill for establishing religious freedom, which prevented the government from using or establishing a state religion. One of the most, of course, controversial historical facts about Thomas Jefferson was his relationship with a lady named Sally Hemings. Sally was an enslaved woman at his home. And a few years after his wife Martha died during childbirth in 1782, Thomas Jefferson is believed to have kept Sally as a concubine. And he is believed to be the father of her 6 children. Now, there's some really interesting facts that you don't regularly hear about Sally. First of all, she was Martha's half sister.
Hmm.
Martha's father had sired Sally with an enslaved woman that he owned. Also, Sally's mother was also sired by a white slave owner and an enslaved woman. Her grandmother, as well, was born of a white slave owner and an enslaved woman,
Hmm.
making Sally really 3/4 white. But of course, at that time in history, any mixture of blood from a person of color was enough to hold you in the ranks of slavery. And also, during that time in our country's history, it was illegal for a white person to marry any person of color. So, in other words, Jefferson couldn't have married her even if he wanted to. But he did free several of the Hemings family in his will. And while many of the slaves that he owned were sold after his death to pay his debts owed, it's really interesting to note that he publicly spoke against slavery. And he actually outlawed the slave trade during his presidency.
Hmm.
Because what he had hoped for was a gradual emancipation for slaves being held. And I know that was a popular theory during that time, where they wanted to abolish slavery in stages so that the plantations could still stay economically sound.
Jefferson is such a fascinating and, like all of us, a flawed human being, right? But I don't know that any of us truly have the guidebook on life, other than, we can refer to scripture, or, we can go to prayer. But he did write that all men were created equal, and yet he owned slaves. He talked about the pursuit of happiness, and he had this relationship with Sally Hemings that I know might raise some of those uncomfortable questions about power, race, and consent, maybe. Um, and I think the temptation is there to either defend him blindly or just cancel him completely, right? And that is the caution that I think we should take when it comes to the founding fathers, because I think there's actually a third option, and that is to just study him honestly, to look maybe with, if we put ourselves into that place, into his shoes, and perhaps try to look through that perspective, we can learn from the contradictions that maybe he embodied.
And
And
I think it's important that we remember too, we weren't there. We
no,
really don't know how Sally Hemings felt about him, and what the situation was. We weren't there. And while we can conjure up ideas, um, we'll never know the truth.
and isn't that also though true even in today, even a day and age in which we do live, but we see people all the time caught between what they believe and how they behave, whether it's politicians claiming moral high ground and then acting unethically, or even just ourselves, right? We try to align our values with our actions. I think what we can learn from Jefferson is it just forces us to ask the question, what do I really believe in? And am I willing to live it out, maybe even if it costs me something? Um, Jefferson's belief that the government is the servant of the people, not the master. And that's a concept that I do think we need to seek to resurrect. We live in an age of digital surveillance or censorship debates and government overreach. So it's worth asking whether we still see government as a tool for the people or something that's starting to control us. So, how do we find that balance where liberty just isn't a buzzword, but something that we can actually protect through awareness and action?
Well, my thought on that is, again, one nation under God. They were all Christian men who were trying to secure a lasting government that would allow their posterity to enjoy the liberties that they fought for. Um, and are we doing that? Are we looking at the future generation? Are we trying to ensure their future? Or are we just trying to get what we want today? Now, next year will be our 250th anniversary. And the current administration has endorsed a year long celebration that's going to culminate next July. I think this is a great year for us to dedicate some time and some energy and some attention to, to this very topic. How do we see government? And what do we want to pass on to the next generation?
Well, and certainly an invitation to explore 250. that is just, it's an incredible number. And I think it's an invitation for all of us to maybe reflect and learn from those men who ultimately sacrificed so much for a cause that they considered to be so important that they were willing to lay everything down. And it's worth us pausing, just to consider what we are doing to ensure that we are also still protecting those same freedoms. As we come to a close, I want to share a thought or a challenge, perhaps, that if we say we want to honor the founding fathers, then maybe it's not just about preserving some frozen image of the past, but it's about honoring their courage to create and imagine a new way of living. Maybe it's about asking ourselves, what kind of country are we building today? Is it one where faith informs character, where morality shapes policy, and where we still believe that freedom comes with a weighty sense of responsibility? That's the challenge. Not to just admire history, but to step into the kind of legacy it invites us to carry forward. In our next episode, we're going to explore the topic of unity and strength, how our perceptions of unity and division can predispose our personal narratives and create strength or weakness. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts or suggest topics for future episodes through our website or social media. Your input helps shape the conversation and makes perspective and potential even more impactful. We're Gwen and Abby, and you've been listening to Perspective and Potential. Until next time, keep exploring new perspectives, and remember that every small change can lead to something big. Food for thought.
Bon appetit.